Waterloo. So thanks so much for listening to Blue Sky Radio. Today's the 19th of July. With me is Maureen Harper, and we're going to speak with her momentarily, but I wanted to say we are Radio Waterloo. You can find us on the radiowaterloo.ca website, as well as in Kitchener and Waterloo, we are 102.7 FM. And currently we're also doing Facebook Live. And we're giving photo credits to Canadian Horse Defense Coalition, Canadians Against Live Export, Animals Angels, and BC Horse Angels. So thank you so much for sharing the photos. This is all to advocate against horse slaughter and the shipping of horses to Japan. So Maureen Harper is a retired CFIA veterinarian who was responsible for the animal transportation program in Ontario and covered the LBPIA airport, which is the Toronto airport, for many years. Thank you so much, Maureen, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Jenny, for having me today.
Thank you so much. This is probably one of the most important programs that I've done. This is a very important topic, and we're just trying to get this message out there about what's happening to the horses. And you and Dr. Judith Sampson-French had received a letter from Minister of Agriculture, Lawrence Macaulay. So do you want to start by sharing a little bit of information about that?
For sure. So Dr. Judith Sampson-French and myself originally had written a letter to Lawrence Macaulay, the Minister of Agriculture, a couple years ago in regards to the shipments of horses being sent to Japan via air for slaughter. And he actually did respond. He provided a couple of responses to that letter within a few months of when we had sent it, which was like August 2016. So much to our surprise, last week, each of us received another email letter from Lawrence Macaulay, the Minister of Agriculture. Dr. Judith Sampson-French received a letter regarding the shipments of horses to Japan. And then the next day, I received a letter from him regarding the slaughter of horses in Canada. So both of us were kind of taken aback a bit because neither of us had written, to our recollection anyway, a letter which precipitated this response from him. So it was kind of interesting. But basically, the letters were just the same old, same old. Dr. Judith Sampson-French's letter from the minister, basically, the one thing that was a wee bit different was he actually acknowledged that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the CFIA, was not enforcing its own animal transport regulations with respect to these shipments going to Japan. So and he also mentioned that in lieu of them not doing that, the CFIA has developed a policy to kind of compensate for them not doing that. So I was really surprised to see that in writing from him, because we all know that policies can never ever supersede federal legislation. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of noteworthy to mention. The letter that I received from him basically was just stating, that the CFIA is the agency that's responsible for overseeing the slaughter of animals, including horses, in federal establishments. And he did mention the equine information documents, which I'm sure we will get into further in our discussion. But he did mention that the equine information documents, the EIDs, were actually they're reviewed by plant management rather than the CFIA, and that apparently the CFIA, as a result of the most recent EU audit, has decided to try and have some oversight of these EIDs that are filled out at auction markets and also at some of the holding premises on an as-needed basis. So that was something new that I learned as a result of this letter. But basically, as I mentioned, it was the same old, because the issues with the EIDs, like I said, that we'll get into, is beyond comprehension. It's just there's no lack of. The CFIA just does not oversee any of the verification of these documents, and that presents a big problem. So, so we each responded to the letters that we received, and of course we haven't heard back yet because those responses were just sent in the last few days. And we were actually told, word on the street was that the Minister of Agriculture was possibly going to lose his portfolio with the cabinet shuffle yesterday, but I don't believe that happened. So as far as I'm aware, he's still the minister.
Okay, so let's bring it back to maybe introducing this topic a little bit for people that may be new to this issue of horse slaughter. What is the problem? I mean, Canada has an export industry as well as a very profitable horse slaughter industry in general. So why is this going on? So
the issue, there's many issues with respect to horse slaughter here in Canada. It's not a huge industry, and it puts money into the hands of the hands of only a few people. And basically, the figures are, I have from 2016, just over 54,000 horses were slaughtered in Canada. Now, the majority of the horses that are slaughtered here, 65 to 70%, are actually horses of U.S. origin. And the reason for that is because the U.S. stopped funding the horse slaughter plants in 2007, so there is no longer horse slaughter taking place in the U.S. And that's what I believe we should be striving for here in Canada. So there are a number of issues. Probably number one in my mind is the fact that horses are not normally raised as food-producing animals, and as a result of that, they're treated with a number of drugs that are prohibited for human consumption. And so as a result of that, it's important that we have proper identification of horses so that we have traceability in the event that there's positive residue testing. And that's where these EIDs come into play. Most food-producing animals here in Canada are required to have unique identification in that they have radio frequency ID tags. But unfortunately, horses do not. Horses have, the CFIA has devised this system whereby horses that are presented at auction markets and they're going for slaughter are identified through these equine information documents through simply a drawing of the horse. So, for example, you may have a bay horse with a star and, 2 white socks. Well, that's not a unique description of an animal. That could describe, 1 million horses here in Canada. So this is the flawed premise of these crazy EIDs. It just does not uniquely identify the animal, and it's not, necessarily from birth either. And so the rationale for having these is to have some kind of identification of the horse, and the document also attests to the fact that the animal hasn't been treated with any drugs previously in the last 6 months. So the other problem with the EIDs is we are very much aware that there's a lot of fraud that is taking place with these documents, and that they're being signed off by kill buyers or people that are not actually owners that have knowledge as to whether or not the animal had received any treatment 6 months prior to going for slaughter. Mm-hmm. And so that puts people at risk, in my mind, that are consuming horse meat. Because, if the documents basically aren't worth the paper they're written on, then what are the assurances that these drugs are not finding their way into the human food chain?
Yeah, and I mean, we learn and read about how horse meat is discovered in, generic labeling. Horse meat sometimes disappears out into other meat products, and it's like a filler in a way, and people don't even know that they're eating horse.
That's correct. There's adulterated meat. There was a study that came out last year that I think it was a very small study, but I think they looked at 10 sausages or something to that effect, and I think 1 of the 10 had adulterated horse meat in it. So people are unwittingly consuming this stuff too. Mm-hmm. And by the way, it was banned in the 1980s for use in pet food because of the high drug residues. So, that's a red flag for me. So why do we ban it for our pets, and yet we're still allowing it to go through the system for human consumption? So the CFIA has patched together this EID system, and, it's horribly flawed. And, I responded to Minister Macaulay's letter, basically citing to him the findings of the EU audit with respect to these documents, because they don't have to listen to me or anybody else, but they do need to be respecting the trading partners' findings, because when they come to do these audits, they're privy to, they make trips to the abattoirs, and they're privy to all the documents that they review, right, so they can do a proper audit of the system. Mm-hmm. And they found that the documents were incomplete and inaccurate, and and in some cases just totally fraudulent. So this is a problem with these EIDs. So that's number one issue in my mind, is the public health issue with respect to the consumption of horse meat in this country.
Yeah.
And the lack of traceability. So if they do find a positive residue testing, the other thing that was ID'd in the audit is there were inconsistencies in follow-ups. For example, as I mentioned, 65-70% of the horses are coming from the U.S., and in one instance, the auditors unearthed the fact that there's a positive residue test from a U.S. origin horse, and the CFIA contacted the U.S.A. to do a follow-up investigation, and it didn't go anywhere. So that's great. So, this is the kind of stuff that's going on out there that, I don't think provides assurances to the public that, we're really dealing with proper food safety when it comes to the consumption of horse meat.
Correct. So how is that possible that the CFIA can kind of ignore its own legislation?
Well, so it's not actually ignoring the legislation with respect to, I guess CFIA defends the fact that I've actually had personal meetings with the CFIA and the current chief veterinary officer, and they're totally in denial that there's any issues with these EIDs. I've actually met with them twice in the last couple of years. And at both meetings, the response from the CFIA was that there were no issues with the EIDs. So that's why when I replied to the Minister of Agriculture, they don't have to listen to Dr. Maureen Harper, okay? They need to listen to the EU food and veterinarian auditors, and basically their findings were exactly what I just stated.
Yeah.
So so when I replied to the minister, that's what I wrote. I cited the findings. I went through the EU audit, and I cited the findings in the EU audit. That there were for example, there were inconsistencies of whether or not the meat was being held when a positive residue was found. Some abattoirs held the meat, some of them tossed it. There were inconsistencies in what the plants did when they were presented with incomplete or inaccurate EIDs. And there was they also identified that there was lack of oversight on the CFIA's part to verify the veracity of the EIDs on the spot. And the meat hygiene manual procedures calls for a trimester review of the veracity of the EIDs, and the EU audit found that wasn't happening either. So all to say that these EIDs, the oversight of these EIDs, is basically placed in the hands of plant management of these establishments, these abattoirs, and the CFIA is basically at arm's length. That's problematic in my mind. And it was problematic in the EU auditors' minds as well, as they identified it. So this is a big problem. If we can't, it's epidemiology, which is the trying to learn disease outbreaks and what causes it. Well, the same thing with food. When trying to trace back positive residues in respect to food. The number one generic thing is you have to have proper identification and traceability in order to, trace it back to the farm of origin and find out what's going on. And that's lacking when it comes to horse slaughter, where it isn't with other animals that are traditionally raised as food-producing animals. So that's important because horses aren't. So horses are being treated with all kinds of drugs that Health Canada does not sanction to be found in meat for human consumption. So it's really even more imperative to have this have this unique identification and traceability if horse meat consumption is going to continue in this country.
How many horses do you think would not be going through the slaughter pipeline for human consumption if they actually followed the protocol?
Well, I think if it was done properly in this country and horses were identified, for example, microchip, for example, from birth on, and records, and as the EU asked for, that records of treatment were maintained, on holdings where horses are raised, and so everything was done properly, I think that it would definitely affect the horses for slaughter pipeline dramatically. We're at whatever, I said 54,000 or what have you from a couple of years ago. It probably would reduce it, it's anybody's best guess, but maybe by half. But the other problem with horse slaughter in this country is, the overbreeding of horses. So it's kind of there's a philosophical note attached as well. I mean, what do we do with unwanted dogs and cats? Do we eat them? No. So do Canadians think that we should be eating horses that are unwanted, knowing the full story of what's going on, that is potentially putting people at risk of consuming these drugs? They're only testing like about 0.5% of the horses that are going through the slaughter houses for residue. So that's and CFIA defends that. Well, that's internationally, that's, a recognized amount, and that's fine. Well, is it really with everything that I'm describing here? I don't know. I certainly would choose not to be eating horse meat, knowing what I know. And then, then there's the other issue of what horses are being subjected to in transport going to slaughter, because as I mentioned, the majority of them are coming from the U.S. So, they're being transported for God knows how many hours without food, water, and rest. The current animal transport regulations allow them to be transported for up to 36 hours without food, water, and rest. Many of them, I'm certain that there are many cases where the animal transport regulations are not being followed, and that compromised animals, heavily pregnant mares. We have examples. We know particular instances where this is happening. Not just horses coming from the U.S., but horses that are being transported in Canada and going to auction marts, and then, being bought by kill buyers and going off to abattoirs. Some of them have foaled right in the auction market, so they've definitely been transported, heavily pregnant, and that's against the regulations. Compromised animals, lame animals, horses with laminitis, all kinds of cases that, these animals should not be transported because it definitely is putting them at risk of undue suffering. And the current legislation does not allow that to happen. But, it's happening far too often, to be frank. So that's another issue, is all the transport infractions that are taking place that, is just basically inhumane treatment of horses, in my view, for these animals that are these unwanted animals, or these animals that are, compromised animals that are being transported. Yeah. And then the other issue is the abattoirs themselves and the flight response of horses, because horses, are a species with an extreme flight response. And a lot of these abattoirs are, there aren't too many of them left, to be honest, but they're retrofitted from, slaughtering, for example, cattle. And cattle and horses are two very different species. And, the kill boxes, et cetera, have not, often, in my opinion, been retrofitted properly to deal with the slaughter, the proper stunning of horses, and then, of course, the extreme flight response. There's countless examples of horses having to be shot many times because they use, from what I understand, they use most of the time 22 caliber rifles, which is not adequate for penetrating the skull properly, and they're moving around because they're not in properly designed kill boxes, and so they're having to be shot multiple times. And there's videos, and there's been news stories about the horses being raised and being bled out while they're still conscious. so this is just, not acceptable. It's egregious and it's unacceptable. And, I think Canadians should be outraged if, they understand really what's happening.
I agree with you fully. And definitely, it makes you wonder how this is possible, that this is happening. And for such a long time, people who advocate for horses, it seemed like we're all talking to each other. And finally, it seems like we're getting word out there a little bit, and that more of the general public is aware. But we need to have a majority of the public get on board with us, because I believe that people don't want to eat horse, actually. We do look at horses as a different type of animal that's helped us throughout time, that's pulled our wagons and have helped us, plow the fields, and they're companion animals. They're, pets, they're therapy animals. Like, horses are very much a unique animal in that way.
That's right. That's why I kind of drew the analogy to, okay, so, what are we doing with dogs and cats? It's not a pretty situation, but unfortunately, unwanted pets are euthanized.
Yeah.
So why I think the horse industry wants to, have its cake and eat it too. They want to continue to overbreed and have, the fastest thoroughbred, or, the best jumper, or what have you, okay? And the losers, in quotation marks, that, don't make the grade, well, we don't want to pay to have a veterinarian have to come and euthanize the animal. We have a system whereby we can just, send it to the auction, and, it goes for slaughter, and wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we get a few bucks in our pocket.
Mm-hmm.
And in the meanwhile, they're not even being forced to have proper identification of the horses. So they're putting the public, in my opinion, at large, that's consuming horse meat, in potential peril.
Yeah.
It's wrong. It's just wrong. And I think Equestrian Canada, formerly Equine Canada, supports horse slaughter, and I think that's a big concern. I think that this is where the problem begins, that the community, the horse community, and I'm not saying everybody, but the Federal Association supports it, and I think that the public is really just not aware all the ins and outs and what's going on. So hopefully, thank goodness, that you're covering this story today, so that hopefully we're getting the message out to people really what is transpiring in this country, because I don't think this is the country that we want to be.
No, I don't.
And if the U.S. stopped slaughtering in 2007, like, where the heck is Canada? Why should we be taking 65 to 70% of their unwanted horses and putting them at peril of long, transporting times? Who knows whether or not they're exceeding 36 hours. But, they're traveling halfway across the country in the States before they even arrive here in Canada. And further to the health issue, as a result of the EU audit that I was referring to earlier, the EU has determined that horses that are going to be slaughtered in order to be eligible for the meat to be exported to the EU, they have to have resided in Canada for 6 months. Okay, because they just do not have any confidence in the EIDs and what's taking place with these American horses coming in.
Wow.
And so they have implemented this as of last March, a year ago March. And so my question to the CFIA was, okay, so what about Canadian consumers that are consuming this meat? The majority of which is consumed in Quebec, but not all of it. There's highfalutin restaurants, for example, downtown Toronto, from my understanding, that serve it.
Mm-hmm.
So what about the rest of Canada? If it's not good enough for the EU, they have to reside for 6 months. How come it's good enough for Canadian consumers?
Very interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
And also in the EU, they're not allowed to transport the animals or the horses for as long either, and they have to stop every so often to.
That's correct.
In case
every 8 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're also identified with a passport from birth. And so the EU also cited that in the audit. The EU is not just doing this to whistle and Dixie. I mean, they've had lots of positive residue tests over there, of phenylbutazol, bute, and clenbuterol, and all kinds of substances, drugs that are used in horses. Because, like I said, they're not normally raised as food-producing animals, so we're not just talking antibiotic residues. We're talking some serious drugs here that have potential ramifications in humans. And so, that's why there are the whole spectrum of inhumane issues that are taking place with respect to the horses going for slaughter. And then there's also this public health concern about the consumption. And the CFIA is just, turning a blind eye to it all. Like I said, I've personally met with them. We've had these discussions. And the question that I was asked by the chief veterinary officer is, what side am I on? At the last meeting a year ago, March. And I said, I'm on the right side, Dr. Comel.
Yeah.
That was my answer back. And so, I think it's important to get this message out to people, what's going on. And maybe it's going to affect how people look at how they partake in horse-related, going to horse shows or going to horse races or what have you. They should be asking questions. Okay, what's happening to these horses afterwards?
Right.
Where are they going? Okay, people are not asking those questions, but they should be.
Yeah.
If they're going to support this industry, then there's another side to the industry that, for example, the Calgary Stampede. So what's happening with those horses when they're done with, competing, for example? There's so many horse rescue people out there that are trying to prevent these unwanted horses, from going to auction markets and, to rescue them from kill buyers.
Yeah, it's basically, it's up to I guess people who truly love horses are stepping up and taking these horses in. Just kind of like, some people, like with poverty, there's now, the public has stepped up and created the food bank kind of thing. So basically the public is doing what the government isn't doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, advocates of horse slaughter have played the devil's advocate and have, questioned people such as myself and said, okay, smarty pants, so you want to wave your magic wand and eliminate horse slaughter tomorrow. What's going to happen to all these horses? People are going to find them left by the side of the road and this and that and blah, 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 blah. Well, it certainly would not be resolved overnight what would happen, but, it may go a long way to help preclude some of this overbreeding from taking place in the first place.
Yeah.
I'm saying it wouldn't happen overnight, for sure. Mm-hmm. I'm not naive, but there may be schemes put in place for subsidization of having horses euthanized by veterinarians or what have you. I mean, what happened in the States? Well, the simple answer is what happened in the States is they still had a pipeline to Canada to get rid of their unwanted horses.
Yeah. Right?
And so if we're taking if the majority of horses that are being slaughtered here in Canada are from the U.S., well, you know what? That's your problem in the States, guys. That's not our problem. We have enough problems here with our own unwanted horses to deal with.
Yeah.
So, that is an issue. And like I'm saying, I'm not naive. That wouldn't be resolved overnight, but it would eventually be resolved.
Well, because now somebody can breed a horse and know that they can easily take it to auction. Like, they don't really have to look at the end of the line. Some people are maybe ignorant. I mean, it kind of blows my mind that somebody who keeps horses and say that they love horses, that they would be okay to send a horse to auction. Like, they kind of don't want to take a look at...
They put blinders on, and they don't want to know the rest of the story. So that's why we're having this discussion today, so everybody understands what the rest of the story is and what is wrong about the system. And there are lots of issues that are wrong.
Yeah, truly.
So half the battle is getting the information out to the public as to what is taking place. I know that you've interviewed Kim in regards to Sargon, the horse. There's another case that's in front of the courts that I can't discuss because it is. But there are incidences of horses that find their way into the slaughter plants and with forged equine information documents, and wink, wink, nudge, nudge, the horse is slaughtered, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's brutal what's happening out there, and the CFIA is aware of these cases, but they're not dirtying their hands, because the CFIA's answer is, well, the EIDs are they're looked after by plant management. And this, like I said, this is what the EU audit, it was a very damning EU audit in my mind. This is what they said. There's not enough oversight on the part of the CFIA. And so I found it interesting in the letter that I received from the minister just last week, saying that as a result of the audit, they're on an as-needed basis, whatever the heck that means, that they're going to have CFIA inspectors at the auctions and at the holding premises to ensure that, I'm just trying to get the wording right here, to ensure that the EIDs are, basically to make sure that they're properly filled out and that the transfer process goes properly. That's what he wrote to me. So that was news to me. And what does an as-needed basis mean? My response back to him, my letter back was, you need to have more veterinary inspectors at these auction markets to oversee the infractions of animal transports that are taking place on a daily basis. Yeah. And I know that for a fact.
Yeah.
That's why they need to be there.
Yeah.
Half of these horses should never have been moved to the auctions in the first place.
That's staggering.
So, I think that, all to say that the CFIA and the horse industry still has a long way to go to step up to the plate if they think that horse slaughter should be continuing in this country. In my mind, I think there are too many adversities to really make it happen properly. And the amount of money just into the hands of only a few does not justify continuing it, in my mind. And if all these issues that we are talking about today are addressed, Jenny, then I think that would take care of business. It would be shutting the plants down if things were done properly. They wouldn't have to legislate it. It just would be a non-starter. It wouldn't happen. Slaughter would stop because there wouldn't be a sufficient flow of horses.
Yeah, well, that would be awesome. That would be awesome. And I'm just reading some of the comments that people are sharing on the Facebook Live here. And Leslie says, how many of these horses could be used in equine therapy programs for troubled youth, veterans, emergency workers, and the government will look to programs that would deal with multiple issues. So
I think it's a mindset. I think that Canadians have to get their heads around, do we want to live in a country whereby this is how we treat horses? It's a mindset. And if the answer is no, then let's put our heads together collectively and figure out how to address this. But to remain to not know about it, so to be living like a little mushroom or to remain in denial, that's just not acceptable.
No.
It's a reflection of our society, and it definitely is, outrageous with respect to what's happening with the horses. It's heartbreaking.
And it goes on year after year after year. I mean, this is such horses keep coming through. Like, we look back over the years, has it changed at all? Are there less horses? Are there more horses? Are the conditions worse? Are they better? Is it the same?
I think slowly but surely I think the trend has been over the last few years that there have been less horses. So that's what I'm saying. It's not like it's a hugely significant industry that if the government finally, and I mean the PMO, all our letters have gone to the PMO, so the Prime Minister has also formally been apprised. Whether he's actually read them himself, that's another story. But we've gone to our MPs. I've had multiple meetings with my MP here in Brampton, and we've also met with Alexandra Mendez and the Animal Welfare Caucus. There was a group of us that went up there in October and discussed horse slaughter in Canada and these horse shipments going to Japan, which we need to also talk about.
Yep.
And so this Animal Welfare Caucus, my understanding is that it was struck about, maybe a year and a half ago to deal with animal welfare issues. So they are well versed in what's happening here and what our concerns are. As is, of course, the Minister of Agriculture, because, of the letters that have gone back and forth that I just spoke about. So nobody can say that they don't know. They can remain in denial and hide behind their statements. But if the Canadian public really held their feet to the fire, they would be finding themselves in an indefensible position, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So we await the powers to be with respect to this Animal Welfare Caucus as to how this is going to proceed. But we made a formal presentation to them Halloween last October, and they are very well versed in the issues, as I've said. So as is my MP, as are many MPs, because many people have gone to their MPs, and we would ask people that are listening today to do the same.
Yes, definitely. I have been to see, I've seen one of our local MPs here, and he wasn't aware that Canada had a horse slaughter industry as such, which was surprising to me.
Right.
But it was a good conversation to have.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, well, and then when they delve into really what's taking place, I'm sure that they become horrified. I mean, I think it was Melissa Fung. I don't quote me, but I think it was Melissa Fung. There was a CBC expose a number of years ago. There were covert videos of what was taking place in some of the slaughterhouses with the horses. And like I said, they were being hoisted up, and they were not rendered unconscious. You know, and they were being bled out, and they were, they were kicking. It was horrible. It was unbelievable to watch. I remember seeing it on TV.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was brutal. So, and it's a problem with their extreme flight response, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
And these retrofitted plants.
Yeah.
But the CFIA defends that, we oversee what's taking place in the plants, and if there are infractions and blah, 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 right, okay. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's touch on the topic of live shipping of horses to Japan. I remember the first time that I was made aware of this, and I saw a picture that Canadian Horse Defense Coalition had taken with a question. Basically, you look at this picture and you see a wooden crate, and it says something like, do you think that there's oranges in there? And look again, and you see horses inside of these
right.
wooden crates. And that was the first time that I learned that Canada, in fact, transports horses from Canada to Japan. And a huge amount of cruelty in this process, and horses obviously suffer tremendously from the moment that they come to the feedlot, obviously, to the moment that they end up in Japan. So did you want to, let's talk about that for a moment.
Yep. So the data that I have in front of me is that, again, we're going back to 2016, that Canada shipped 5,839 live horses, draft horses, to Japan for slaughter by air. The majority of which that are going out of the Calgary, Edmonton, and I think some are going from the Winnipeg airport. And this, I worked for the CFIA for 30 years, and I wasn't even aware that these shipments had been taking place for many, many years. So I just learned about them a couple of years ago, and I've been retired for 6 or 7 years now. And I was like, when I saw the Canadian Horse Defense Coalition photos and videos online, I almost fell off my chair. I worked for many, many years at the Toronto airport, and I never, ever, ever in my career saw horses being shipped in this manner. I was flabbergasted and horrified. So I actively, rolled up my sleeves and became involved. And, have had meetings with the CFIA and written letters to the minister along with Dr. Judith Sampson-French, and I've worked with all the people from the Canadian Horse Defense Coalition. And basically, this is really outrageous in that the CFIA is not enforcing their own animal transport regulations. Okay, so horses over 14 hands, because the current regulations dictate the horses over 14 hands are required to be segregated from one another. So that's not happening with many of these shipments. Not to say that all the horses are over 14 hands, but a good lot of them are. They're draft horses and draft crosses. And secondly, that the current regulations also dictate that their tops of their head, when they're held in normal position, standing position, that their tops of their heads are not to come in contact with the tops of the containers. Mm-hmm. So both of these infractions have been cited and actually have been acknowledged by the CFIA in the numerous ATIP access to information documents that have been acquired over the years. So my question is, And, I posed this question in the Canadian Vet Journal, in the ethics section. How is it the CFIA thinks that they can get away with not enforcing their own current federal legislation with these shipments? Okay, yeah. It's outrageous. These horses are crammed into these wooden containers, unsegregated, almost, just like sardines in a can, in many instances. Then the CFIA's response at meetings when we've discussed this is, these are very valuable horses, and, we respect the fact that we're providing the best care for them and yada, yada, yada. Really? Okay, well, there's ATIP documents out there demonstrating that horses have gone down and have died and have been found upside down in these containers. Like, give your heads a shake, guys, okay? And it is totally contrary to the OIE, so the World Organization for Animal Health, the Terrestrial Animal Health Code dictates also that horses over 57 inches are required to be segregated, and it further says that horses need 8-inch head clearance, whereas other species only 4. The issue with horses is, in order for them to have proper balance, especially, on landing and takeoff when they're being shipped by air, that they need to have lots of room on either side, 3 inches at least at the widest point on either side, and 8-inch head clearance. And that's not being respected with many of these shipments.
No.
So, the bottom line is, and I have personal information from a friend who I actually found out about these shipments from in the first place, that industry just wants to be able to ship as many horses per container because it's all about, bottom line, the profit.
Yeah.
If they're forced to have to separate the horses, for example, and have, 2 per crate, well, there goes 2 other horses that, you can only ship X number of animals, right? You're cutting the number of animals in half. Well, that's just unfortunate. But the legislation is what it is. Now, the CFIA's response is, well, they're buddies, they need to be buddies, so they need to travel together. Well, that's just malarkey, okay? If that's the case, separate them from the withers down so they can see each other, right? But still have them separated so they have proper room to maneuver, to balance. And if one goes down, it has a chance of getting up without being trampled on by another horse.
Yeah.
Okay, but no. The other issue with respect to that is, they're being raised on feedlots, and that's a whole other issue unto itself. The conditions, without proper shelter and just piles of manure, and I'm not sure whether or not you have photos of them, how they're being raised, but it's atrocious what's going on out there. And so they're semi-feral, they're not even really being handled. So, they're not deriving any benefit of being crammed in together side by each. They're just not. And regardless, the regulations stipulate that if they're over 14 hens, they need to be segregated, period. As do the International Air Transport Association live animal regs. And my understanding that these carriers, the airlines that are taking these animals, are IATA member airlines, so they ought to be following the IATA live animal regs.
It's really interesting how they're able to just turn a blind eye and continue to do this, even though they're breaking their regulations. And the cruelty is unbelievable. And yeah, we do have some pictures scrolling on the video podcast that shows some of the conditions of the horses in feedlots. So thank you to Animals Angels, as well as Canadian Horse Defense Coalition. We also had some information from the International Horse Registry as well. So thank you to all. Hopefully with the amount of more advocacy, and it seems like such an uphill battle. And I'm wondering, is there lobbying that happens on behalf of the slaughter industry itself? Like, are they lobbying to continue this, or is it just something that is so ingrained and this is a culture of thinking?
Well, there have been a number of petitions. I think that maybe you put one online as well, by a number of people, and there's currently one right now, federal petitions, right? So that means they have to be presented in the House and Parliament for people to sign to voice their concerns with respect to the fact that the CFIA is not enforcing its own current legislation. Now, interestingly enough, and I've called the CFIA on this as well, too, through my letters to them when I commented on their newly proposed animal transport regs, and also to my letters to the Minister of Agriculture, that the CFIA is proposing, and so the animal transport regulations have not been updated in the last 40 years. So finally, over a year ago, the CFIA came out with newly proposed animal transport regs. And so the way the system works, there's a finite period of time whereby people can provide their comments, and then that period closes, and then the CFIA reviews the comments and then decides to promulgate the regulations. So that closing period was February of 2017, last year. And here we are now in July of 2018, and we still do not have the new regs out. But interestingly enough, in the newly proposed regs, the CFIA is removing the fact that horses have to be segregated if they're over 14 hands, and is also removing horses, not other species, but horses, no longer the requirement that their head doesn't touch the top of the container. Now, to put this in perspective, like I said, the OIE and IATA all stipulate 8-inch head clearance for horses vis-a-vis 4 inches for other species, and the CFIA is removing the fact that horses' heads don't have to touch the top of containers in these new regs, and this is supposed to be an improvement? Really? Why are they doing that? Because they know they're not enforcing their own current legislation as we speak. That's why. And I'm not saying anything today that I haven't told them to their face.
Yeah, I believe you. And
so people should be incensed. These are civil servants that are being paid through public monies, and they're not enforcing their own current animal transport regulations, thereby potentially putting these horses that are being shipped to Japan for slaughter in harm's way. Where is the accountability? Where is it? It's a big question.
Yeah.
It hasn't been for lack of effort on the part of many, many people, Jenny. Many people. And CFIA and industry are just smirking and laughing behind the scenes. Really? Okay. I mean, I can't be. You can hear the exasperation in my voice because
yes.
we have been working I only personally for the last couple of years, but many people from the Canadian Horse Defense Coalition, they've been getting ATIP documents, access information documents, for many, many years. Many people have gone out covertly to photo what's happening with these shipments, to take videos and photos. To what end? There's no accountability. People should be incensed.
I hope that they will be. I really hope that they will be. And I can't imagine why they would remove this whole idea that horses need more headspace and that it's there for a reason. Like, how can they go backwards? They've actually made it worse now then.
That's right. These newly proposed animal transport regulations, after waiting for them to be updated for 40 years, are going to be worse because they're removing these requirements. And they're saying that the rationale is they need to be shipped together because so they can, they're compatible, so they can comfort each other. Well, let me tell you, as a veterinarian who worked many, many years at the Toronto airport, there is no way that a veterinarian on the spot is able to assess whether or not one horse is compatible with another. And in fact, in some of the access to information documents, the CFIA has admitted when horses have been found, trampled on and hurt and killed, they were not compatible, so they made a wrong assessment. Really? Okay. You cannot assess that on the spot. So you do the right thing and you segregate them.
Yeah.
So they have adequate room to move around for proper balance, and if they go down, God forbid, they have a chance of getting up and not being trampled on.
The whole situation is, it's so difficult to even talk about this because, I mean, it is so barbaric. That's actually what it is. We have to be, like, basically we would have to be okay with this violence against horses and just turn a blind eye like the other people are doing. And obviously there's a lot of money going into, just like you said, there's a lot of money being made for some people. And especially with a shipment to Japan where they consider horse meat or fresh horse meat a delicacy, the value at that point is just outrageous.
Yeah, these horses are worth big bucks. They're making big money. But like I said, in the hands of a few. It's not like the majority of Canadians are deriving any benefit from this.
Nor would they want to.
And again, you know, it comes down to the philosophical question, like I said earlier. Is this the society that Canada wants?
Yeah.
I mean, as a veterinarian who worked for the CFIA for 30 years, when I learned that we were shipping these beautiful draft horses to Japan for slaughter, I was flabbergasted, and I was not happy.
No.
Right? And then I delved into it, you know, and became involved and saw the videos and the photos online. And then I was totally horrified when I saw. And the person who had informed me about the shipments in the first place, I confronted him and said, what are you guys doing? I worked at the airport as a veterinarian for the CFIA for many years, and this person worked there too. And he has acknowledged that what they're doing is wrong. But CFIA is allowing them to do it, Jenny. You see, it's beyond words. It's beyond words. People should, when they learn of this, should be outraged and should be going to their MPs and should be raising hell.
I agree with you.
I can't say it more succinctly, but it's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and when CFIA brings this new legislation out, it's going to be very difficult for us to do very much because the new legislation will be put forward and these requirements are going to be removed.
That's disgusting. Truly.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's not for lack of our effort in trying to garner media support. You know, a number of us have, you know, done interviews and articles have been written and, you know, people are being informed as you are, you know, doing today with me. But we need to affect the change. We really
do.
You know, and I think, you know, one way that people can help that are listening to us today is to no holds barred, go to their MPs, write letters, and just, you know, voice their concerns and their outrage to the politicians. They need to get the message loud and clear. And, you know, in particular, this Animal Welfare Caucus that's headed up by Alexandra Mendez, as I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Because they sat and listened to our presentation last fall, and so they're acutely aware of all these issues that we're discussing today.
It's one of those dirty little secrets, but it's not really a secret anymore. But I mean, for some people, it blows my mind that people aren't aware of this. But Canada is a big country, and people are very busy. You know, they have busy lives, and you know, it's a difficult world we live in. We're bombarded with information continuously. But the thing is that people love horses. Sometimes people who don't even have access to horses express love and adoration of horses, and they're outraged when they find out that this is what we're doing to them. So the public don't agree with horses being food animals, and they for sure don't think that horses should be shipped overseas for slaughter. And but I mean, you know, like again, how do we affect change? Because obviously politicians and groups make these decisions that affect all of us.
Well, the unfortunate truth is oftentimes what happens is the politicians are being dictated and the civil service are being dictated by industry as to what to do.
Yeah.
You know, and for example, these new animal transport regulations, here we are, you know, like I said, the closing period was February 2017. Here we are like a year and a half later and still no new regulations. And I'll tell you my take on that. The reason for that is the CFIA is wrestling with all the comments and all the pushback from industry because, to their credit, they did try and lower some of the transport times without food, water, and rest for a number of species. And there's been, you know, great pushback from industry. industry doesn't want to see any changes because it's going to affect their bottom line, with respect to profits and money. So it's like the CFIA is having to balance animal welfare concerns with industry's profit.
Yeah.
That's, to summarize it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And is that really how it should be, ideally? I don't know. They're the regulatory agency that's saddled with the task of overseeing animal transport, regulations and enforcement. For what reason? For the welfare of the animals, not for the profit of industry.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be their prime concern.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, they had all kinds of opportunities to introduce requirements. You're probably familiar with the Anita Krines case where she was, giving the poor pigs water that was heading for slaughter,
yep.
and then was charged, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in this extreme heat that we've had, still continues to be cases of, pigs dying en route for slaughter in the heat, being overcrowded in the trailers. The CFI had an opportunity to put in the new legislation that the transport vehicles, have temperature control and ventilation controls and all this kind of stuff, and they chose not to do that. Why?
Yeah.
That's my question after 40 years. Why? And again, I'm not saying anything today here, Jenny, that I haven't written to them.
Yeah.
In my comments. So, I mean, it goes back to the whole philosophical question that we have. Are we outraged when we see a dog sitting in a car with the windows rolled up tight on a hot summer day, and somebody will break the window to rescue the dog, but yet we turn a blind eye to what's happening with our livestock that are being sacrificed for our consumption?
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with the horses. We, as a society, cannot afford to be turning a blind eye. And we need to hold our elected officials and our civil servants to a higher standard. That's the Canada that I want to live in.
Me too.
And as a veterinarian, that's what I'm sworn to uphold. And so that's why I'm using my voice as a veterinarian.
Thank you. I wish more people would follow in your footsteps and use their professional caucus, if you will, to do exactly what you're doing, because it seems like many veterinarians are, in fact, turning a blind eye. And then I suppose they must be following the money themselves, too. It's difficult to stand out in the face of adversity, right? It's very difficult to speak up because oftentimes there are others that, they say, well, don't you understand? It has to be this way, or, money has to be exchanged. And we understand politics, but the welfare of horses, I mean, what else are we going to sacrifice? What else? What's next?
Exactly. It becomes a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Right? It becomes a slippery slope. If this is the society that we want to live in and how we're treating our animals, then what happens next with human beings?
Yeah.
And we're seeing that today as we speak.
Yeah.
So, I have tried to reach out to other veterinarians, Dr. Judith Sampson French, of course, and myself. We have tried to reach out by our articles and our comments in the CVJ and the Canadian Vet Journal. So we've put it out front and center for other veterinarians to be aware of what's taking place as well.
Right on. That's good.
Well, if veterinarians are not going to step up to the plate, well, then who is going to?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, because, I would assume that people get into that profession because they care about animals and want to help animals, right?
Yes.
Critical thinking is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so animal welfare is a very important aspect of providing care for animals.
Mm-hmm.
Right up there at the top, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Right?
Well, we're coming up to the very end of our hour here, Maureen, so thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
And
thank you very much for having me and for, putting this important information out for people to sort of, learn about and maybe to digest and hopefully take some action.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much, Maureen. We'll for sure have you on again, and we can see if there's been any updates or improvements in the near future.
Great. Thanks so much, Jenny.
Bye, Maureen.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. So thank you for listening to this segment that we were doing on horse slaughter and the live shipping. This is Radio Waterloo, 102.7 FM in Kitchener. We are a nonprofit organization. Feel free to give to the station. We are all volunteers. And think about the horses and visit your MP to discuss this important matter. And stay hydrated and have a